When Alaskans created the Permanent Fund, it was a grand experiment. Other oil provinces had tried to preserve some of their wealth for future generations. Few, if any, had succeeded.
Money, it's a gas. Grab that cash with both hands and make a stash.
9 years after statehood, the oil strike at Prudhoe Bay in 1968 ushered in a new era of prosperity for the 49th state. But while the state treasury received $900 million in lease bonuses the next year, the money was quickly spent, and Alaskans worried that more oil wealth would slip through their fingers. They became determined to cushion the boom and bust cycle that had plagued states and countries with natural resource wealth.
Share it fairly, but don't take a slice of my pie.
For several years, legislators and residents debated what to do with the pending windfall. Eventually, they settled on a long-term savings account, an idea first put into legislation by Governor Keith Miller in 1970. Voters in 1976 decided on a constitutional amendment to set aside 25% of royalty and lease income from the oil fields. Today, the question is whether fund income can be used for government. As budget reserves shrink, the day of reckoning approaches on the state fiscal gap, and policymakers are revisiting the circumstances surrounding the creation of the Permanent Fund. Perhaps no other part of state government has undergone as much scrutiny. The investment policies gradually have been liberalized over the years, growing the fund to $25 billion and beyond, exceeding the dreams of its founders. The dividend program established in 1982 has given every resident a share of the oil wealth. But the dividend also has made for complicated discussions about the state's tax structure and about the civic obligations of Alaskans.
Money, get back. I'm alright, Jack. Keep your hands off of my stack.
And as 2003 came to a close, there were competing proposals for constitutional amendments to change the structure of the fund or the dividend. If there's any consensus, it's that Alaska, due to the foresight of a generation of political leaders, has built itself an asset that is the envy of other states.
Our Constitution, Section 8, or Article 8, Section 8.2 says, "Thou shalt manage our resources for the maximum benefit of the people." Now that's all the people. And I submit the program that best meets that mandate, if not perhaps the only program that meets it, is the dividend program.
The dividend is a negative tax. It's a shareholder payment. It's an entitlement. But I mean, it's all of those things. It certainly is an entitlement, and you're entitled to it if you have your feet planted on that piece of dirt we call Alaska.
Many Alaskans believe this is an entitlement. I don't. I think the Permanent Fund dividend was one of the worst things that we got ourselves into a number of years ago. But having said that, since we're there, I think it's important to recognize that the dividend has played an important part in the economy of Alaska. And to just cut that off would be, I think, totally embarrassment to this legislature and to the state.
We've really taken an experiment that no nation, communist or capitalist, no state in the Union really has tried. We're trying to have a commonly owned resource without all the negative attributes of the common ownership that the socialist states tried.
The federal government, under the Statehood Compact, granted the state of Alaska those natural resources in which to pay our own way. Therefore, we own those natural resources in common, but those rights are not severable. They are not to be apportioned to an individual.
Government's purpose is to organize and provide services that the public wants, that they need. So you have one sewer system for the community, one department taking care of roads. That's what government does. That's why we pay taxes. That's why government has user fees or takes royalty off oil and gas, is to provide the services that an organized, functioning society needs. Government is not there to turn a profit and give it back to us.
The permanent fund is an anomaly for a political system. Here's this fund, and it goes out to everybody equally, whether they supported me or not, whether they agree with me or not, whether they're in my district or not. We've got this thing that is anti-political. It's personal, individual choices that aren't controlled by the power structure, by who's in the leadership, who's in charge, who's elected.
There's so many Alaskans who weren't here at the time the permanent fund was created. And many of them call the fund the Alaska Permanent Dividend Fund, because in their mind, the purpose of the permanent fund is solely to pay a dividend.
Today's privileges are tomorrow's demands. And if you've gotten the fund for several years, that becomes natural, that becomes the norm. And you don't want to go back. And you can almost think of an excuse why you shouldn't get rid of it. You know, can't trust government, they'll spend it, they'll waste it, you know, this and this. But what you're really saying is, I want my money. That's what people are saying, and I understand that. I want my money too.
The dividend is a major defense against invasion of the fund itself. One of the major reasons that I felt a dividend was necessary to do two things. One, protect the fund against casual invasion by legislature, and two, the other thing was to, I put it crudely, counter selective greed with collective greed. At the very least, we ought to rope off more of the lease bonus and royalty dollars, get them into the permanent fund, have the permanent fund then earning revenues that can create a new income stream, half of which I believe should go into state government operations, which otherwise would be paid for from taxes or inappropriate revenues. The other half of which I would like to see go back to the people in the form of some sort of tax credit.
Governor, I can remember the discussion. Remember we were talking about energy tax credits and the whole idea of the dividend. In fact, I can remember where the dividend got its name. Roger Lang, we had a meeting of Native leadership, and Roger Lang came in. We were talking energy tax credit. He said, Governor, you're talking permanent fund dividend.
I will give Governor Hammond and others credit. I mean, it really did initially protect the fund from being a, quote, development fund. So I think it was very important. It may, in some ways, have grown to be a monster in this day and age, but it was essential at the time.
I can tell you for sure that there was no public clamor. I worked very hard to get a dividend program established, and I and the folks that were involved in that found very little public interest. It was just not even on the radar screen. And in the end, the reason that that there was a dividend was because Governor Hammond said he would veto the capital projects that legislators had on their in the budget if they didn't pass a dividend program.
It, I think, is an extremely important piece of legislation in that it provides what I believe is for the first time a mechanism that will assure that all Alaskans receive a portion of their oil wealth distributed on an equitable basis in such a way that they will come to realize that there's other things we can do with your oil wealth than simply put it into more government programs. This program will provide that all Alaskans receive some share of the earnings of that oil wealth, which they can then spend as they choose for whatever programs or activities or living expenses that may encumber them unduly. If I could, I would make it retroactive 10 years.
The principals in Alaska's permanent fund dividend case presented themselves at the U.S. Supreme Court. At issue, the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend Law, passed in 1980, ruled unconstitutional by a state superior court, a decision which was reversed and declared constitutional by the Alaska Supreme Court. The plaintiffs, Ron and Penny Zobel of Anchorage, took their case to the nation's highest court. On the third day of the court's fall session, the first session in which a woman justice sits, the Alaska case was first on the court's agenda. Governor Jay Hammond and his wife Bella were among the first to arrive at the court.
They named me as the defendant. It actually was Zobel versus Williams. There were two cases there. We had a permanent fund dividend, which was based on how many years since statehood people had been residents. They would, in the first year, they would get a $50 dividend for each full year of residence, up to a maximum of $1,000. And that was Zobel 1, let's call it.
It was seen, I think, almost as a reward or a badge of honor that we, who lived here longer, had more right to that money than you, who just got here.
Then there was Zobel 2, which was over an income tax, which the legislature passed the same session as they created the dividend program. The income tax phased out. If you just arrived in your first year of residency in Alaska, you paid tax at the full rate.
It's the right of every citizen to move around in this country, and when you go to another state and you become a citizen of that state, you get every right that every other citizen in that state has. There are no second-class citizens in the state of Alaska, and that's what the issue's all about.
The income tax was struck down in the state courts by the Alaska Supreme Court, first in the Superior Court and then in the state Supreme Court. But the dividend was upheld in the state Supreme Court and went to the United States Supreme Court.
And yet it got struck down by the Supreme Court in what I thought was one of the most asinine decisions. They said if we'd gone prospectively, it would have been legitimate. At least that's what our Chief Justice here, who incidentally supported the state program, but it was appealed to the higher court, said if you'd gone prospectively, been home free.
If you let people get one dividend this year, and then next year gave them another dividend so they would have 2 dividends, and then the third year they'd have 3, and newcomers next year would only have 1, but they'd build it up, that might be okay in the eyes of those justices.
There were many people who didn't like it, but you know, Alaska is a transient state, and over time there's many more people that have benefited as a result of that ruling than haven't. So I would have to say that if people really knew the facts and they look back on it, they'd have to be glad that the Zobels brought that suit.
We had legislation standing by in the event that the dividends were struck down. The legislature passed a law saying, well, the first year's dividend then will be $1,000 instead of the $50 a year scheme, because that will represent about 3 years worth of dividends, which will be how long the program will have been enjoined by the time the U.S. Supreme Court renders its decision.
The $1,000 that was paid out after the Supreme Court decision in '82. The $1,000 actually came from the general fund.
There's no picture of the signing of the permanent fund dividend legislation, and the curious...
I'll tell you why.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll tell you why. Because after it got Zobelized, I was so distraught with it that I wouldn't even sign the dividend check. I thought they had so perverted the intent of the original bill that although it was better than nothing in my view.
Well, I remember one conversation, I said, he's indicated he was thinking of vetoing it. I got on the phone and called Av Gross, come up here. I called Dawson, get up here.
Kent Dawson.
We need you to come in and talk to the governor. We got a big problem here.
There was a time that dividend was a pretty strange creature the first year it got paid. Now, of course, it's as natural as getting up out of bed in the morning. But in those days, it was a foreign concept. There wasn't anything like it. And, you know, even people who have later become fierce proponents of it really had to scratch their head about what are we doing here. It was a brand new, novel approach to government.
I campaigned against the dividend program. And I thought all the money should stay in the permanent fund and not have a dividend. And everybody around me said, oh, you're right, Sheffield. And so I filed a bill when I got here. And it was all by myself. There was not a soul around with me. And then I became Hammondized and realized the good that it did do. It would help protect the corpus of the permanent fund, but it also helped an awful lot of people buy an extra bedroom, a carpet for the downstairs bedroom, and put a garage on the house. And some, of course, bought snow machines and RVs and went to Hawaii.
Almost 90% of our oil wealth goes out in what I call inequitably dispersed government service dividends in the form of programs and so forth and projects for which we pay nothing in the way of taxes and which affect you differently than her, than him, and so forth. Inequitably dispersed government dividends, whereas the cash dividend program is absolutely equitably dispersed.
And the magic figure is $1,107.56. All right, congratulations, Alaska.
You can tax booze for my money, smokes for my health, pass an income tax, take all of my wealth, but don't you mess with my PFD. You can do anything but lay off of my PFD.
And now the news you've been waiting for, this year's dividend is $1,769.84. Thank you.
PFD, you can do anything but lay off of my PFD.
I would rather keep the dividend and be taxed a little bit, I think, just because we've gotten used to it. I've been here for over 20 years, and it's kind of something that everybody looks forward to every October.
Yeah, it's a unique, great thing that nobody else in the country has.
So now that you're unemployed, how important is this dividend today?
Survival. Survival. I'm in survival mode right now. And every little bit helps.
It's the lower income people that benefit the most from the dividend because it's a larger share of their income. And also it tends to benefit rural Alaska more than urban Alaska because of the lower overall incomes in rural areas.
Low-income families, rural families, where there isn't much cash out there and there aren't a whole lot of jobs to get, that dividend coming into that household has been an important part of lifting their lifestyle. I don't mean lifting it into SUVs and TVs, I mean lifting it into food and medical care.
Alaska is the only state in the United States that during the 90s had a leveling of the income distribution. Every other state in the United States, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Clearly that was the result of the dividend.
If you can't pay your bills, you shouldn't be handing out money. And if you want more losers moving to the state, you want more crime, just keep handing it out.
Permanent fund dividend has a huge effect on Alaska's population. There are probably 75,000 people living in Alaska right now who wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the permanent fund dividend. Perhaps 30 or so thousand of Alaskans are here because of jobs that wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the permanent fund dividend. The second effect, and one that's very difficult for people to understand, is the birth incentive and the birth effect. The major impact on the migration is in delaying people's departure from Alaska.
The vicious, mean, nasty letters we get from people who were denied a dividend because they didn't meet eligibility requirements, we get them from someone in Delta Junction saying, well, you give it to those damn Ukrainians, they're not even Americans. That's a nice attitude. Or let's see, there was a couple, supposedly lived in Anchorage. He was an airline pilot and commuted, so I don't know how much of a residency he had. And his wife, they were denied, and they wrote on their denial letter, sent it back to us, saying, well, just forget it, I'm not going to appeal, just go give it to drunk natives. That's what you do with it anyhow.
It's the old story of should you give a person a fish or should you give them a pole so they catch a new fish every day? And we're giving them a fish, we're giving them the dividend.
The very thing that Jay Hamlin came up with, the idea of the dividend to protect the fund, was the thing that really killed its purpose. So it's an irony there, I think.